My name is Talia Brennan, and I was sitting across from my hospital's chief medical officer in a conference room with the blinds drawn, listening to him ask me to change 3 timestamps in a dead man's chart, when I understood that the next sentence out of my mouth was going to end either his career or mine. 2 days earlier, a 54-year-old patient named Robert Iyer had died on the operating table at Alden Regional Medical Center in Denver, 11 hours after a routine gallbladder procedure had gone catastrophically wrong. 2 weeks earlier, I had been promoted to lead patient safety investigator for the surgical division, a job that mostly involved chasing down near misses and paperwork errors before they became something worse. And 2 hours earlier, I had pulled the electronic medical record audit trail for Robert Iyer's case and found something that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. A critical anesthesia alert had been silenced, deliberately, by someone with administrative override access, for minutes before it would have flagged a dangerous oxygen saturation drop to the surgical team. I hadn't gone looking for a scandal. I had gone looking for the truth because that was, on paper, literally my job description. But the moment I brought what I'd found to my supervisor, I watched the hospital's carefully rehearsed instinct for self-protection kick into motion, one calm, reasonable-sounding request at a time, and I understood, with a clarity that still makes my hands cold when I think about it, that the people asking me to help manage the narrative around Robert Iyer's death had absolutely no intention of ever telling his widow the truth. What none of them knew, not the chief medical officer sliding a revised timeline across the table like it was a reasonable compromise, not the surgical director already rehearsing a statement for the state health department, not even Robert Iyer's own widow, who had been told her husband died of a rare, unavoidable complication, was that I had made a backup copy of that unaltered audit trail before I ever walked into that conference room, because 11 years in hospital administration had taught me exactly one non-negotiable lesson: never bring evidence into a room full of people who benefit from it disappearing. They thought I would fall in line the way everyone before me apparently had. They had no idea I'd already decided, somewhere between reading that audit trail and walking into that meeting, that I would rather lose this job than spend the rest of my life knowing I'd helped bury the truth about how a man died. 9 months before Robert Iyer's death, I had transferred into Alden Regional's Patient Safety Department after 6 years working General Hospital Administration, drawn to the role because I genuinely believed, maybe naively, that most medical errors happen not because people were careless, but because systems failed the people trying to do their best inside them. My job was to investigate incidents, identify systemic gaps, and recommend fixes before small problems became fatal ones. It was quiet, detail-oriented work, mostly invisible unless something went wrong, and I liked it precisely because it felt like the kind of job that made hospitals genuinely safer. My direct supervisor was a woman named Renata Ashford, the hospital's director of quality and risk management, sharp, articulate, and, I would come to understand far too slowly, deeply committed to a particular philosophy about how hospitals should handle mistakes, quietly, internally, and in a way that protected the institution's ability to keep operating, on the theory that a hospital under state sanction or drowning in lawsuits couldn't help anyone at all. I didn't fully disagree with her at first. There is a real, defensible argument that public panic over rare medical errors can do more harm than good, and Renata made that argument often with genuine conviction, not as a cynical excuse but as something she seemed to actually believe kept the hospital functioning for the thousands of patients it served every year who never experienced anything close to a serious error. What I didn't yet understand was how easily that philosophy applied without limits could curdle into something closer to a cover-up than a policy. The first small sign came in December, 4 months before Robert Iyer's surgery, when I investigated a medication error involving an elderly patient who received a 10-fold overdose of a blood thinner due to a decimal point transcription mistake. The patient survived after an anxious 48 hours in the ICU, and my investigation traced the error clearly back to a broken verification protocol between 2 departments, a systemic gap that, left unaddressed, could easily produce a fatal outcome in a less lucky patient. I submitted a report recommending a mandatory double verification system for anticoagulant dosing. Renata thanked me for the thoroughness, told me it would be reviewed by the safety committee, and the recommendation quietly died somewhere in that review, never implemented, never explained. Sometimes, she told me when I asked about it in February, the fix costs more in disruption than the risk justifies. We monitor. We adjust gradually. We don't blow up a whole department's workflow over one incident. I told myself she probably had more context than I did. I told myself that a lot over those months because it was easier than the alternative. Robert Iyer was admitted to Alden Regional on a Wednesday morning in April for a scheduled laparoscopic gallbladder removal, a routine procedure performed at the hospital dozens of times a month with an excellent safety record. He was 54, healthy aside from the gallstones, married for 26 years, with 2 adult daughters who had both driven in from out of state to be there for what everyone expected to be an uneventful overnight stay. I wasn't in the operating room. I never am. My job starts after something goes wrong, piecing together what happened from records, monitoring logs, and staff interviews, the way a person reconstructs a car accident from skid marks instead of watching it happen. What the initial incident report described was straightforward, almost boringly so, an unexpected and severe allergic reaction to an anesthesia agent, difficult to predict, difficult to reverse quickly enough once it began, resulting in cardiac arrest and, despite 40 minutes of resuscitation efforts, Robert Iyer's death on the table. It was tragic. It was, according to the surgical director's initial assessment, a rare and largely unavoidable complication. It was also, I discovered less than 48 hours later, not remotely the full story. I pulled the case for a standard mortality review, the kind of routine audit my department performed on every surgical death, expecting to confirm the initial assessment and move the case toward a standard root cause report. Instead, when I opened the electronic medical records underlying audit trail, the kind of granular system log that tracks every keystroke, alert, and override during a procedure, I found a 4-minute gap that didn't match the narrative in the official chart at all. At 10:47 that morning, the anesthesia monitoring system had triggered a critical alert for a dangerous oxygen saturation drop, the kind of alert designed specifically to catch exactly this sort of complication early enough to intervene. According to the audit trail, that alert had been manually silenced 11 seconds after it triggered, using an administrative override credential, and had never appeared in the version of events described to the surgical team, to Robert Iyer's family, or in the official incident report I'd been given to review. The credential used to silence the alert belonged to a surgical department administrator named Colin Massey, someone I'd worked alongside for months, without a single reason to suspect him of anything. I sat with that discovery for the better part of an hour before I did what I'd always been trained to do. I brought it to my supervisor. Renata's reaction, when I showed her the audit trail, was not surprise. It was something closer to weary resignation, the expression of someone confirming a fear rather than encountering a shock, and that reaction alone told me more than anything she said afterward. "I need you to slow down before you do anything with this," she said. "There's context here you don't have yet." The context, as she explained it over the following hour, was this. The anesthesia monitoring system at Alden Regional had a documented history of false positive alerts, frequent enough that some staff had developed a habit of manually silencing alarms they believed were spurious, a practice quietly tolerated by hospital leadership for years because addressing the underlying equipment problem would have required a costly, disruptive overhaul the hospital's board had repeatedly declined to fund. Colin Massey, Renata said, likely believed in good faith that he was silencing a false alarm, the same way staff had done dozens of times before without consequence, and simply happened, this once, catastrophically, to be wrong. I asked her, carefully, why none of that appeared in the official incident report. Because it opens the hospital to liability for the underlying equipment failure, not just the individual decision, she said. If this gets out exactly the way the raw data reads, it's not a tragic, rare complication anymore. It's a hospital that knew its alarm system had a credibility problem and let staff quietly work around it for years instead of fixing it. That's not just a lawsuit, Talia. That's a state investigation. That's potentially the surgical department's accreditation. That's real people's jobs, and it doesn't bring Robert Iyer back. I understood intellectually everything she was describing. I also understood, with a clarity I couldn't talk myself out of no matter how reasonable her tone remained, that Robert Iyer's widow had been told a story that left out the single most important fact, that his death might have been prevented if a known, unaddressed problem with hospital equipment hadn't led someone to silence the exact alert designed to save his life. 2 days later, I was called into the conference room with Renata and the hospital's chief medical officer, a polished, soft-spoken man named Dr. Preston Okafor, who thanked me warmly for my thoroughness before sliding a revised incident timeline across the table, one that removed the 4-minute gap entirely and reframed the entire event as a sudden, unpredictable anaphylactic reaction with no preceding alert of any kind. "We'd like your report to align with this version," he said. "Not because anything is being hidden, because the raw audit data, without proper context, tells a misleading story that could unfairly damage this hospital's ability to keep serving patients." I asked him whether Robert Ayer's widow would be told about the silenced alert. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a legal conversation, not a clinical one," he said. "It's above both our pay grades." I told him I needed to think about it. What I didn't tell him was that I had already made a secure backup copy of the unaltered audit trail before that meeting, on the theory that any version of events convenient enough to erase 4 crucial minutes from a man's death deserved a healthy dose of my own paranoia. I spent the following week in a kind of controlled, quiet crisis, going through the motions of my job while turning the decision over and over in my mind. I researched whistleblower protections for hospital employees under both federal and Colorado state law. I looked into how the state health department handled reports of falsified incident documentation. I thought, more than once, about simply staying quiet, finishing out the revised report, and telling myself that Renata's reasoning, however uncomfortable, wasn't entirely wrong about the complexity of the situation. What ultimately changed my mind wasn't a single dramatic realization. It was a phone call, unplanned and unexpected, from a surgical nurse named Priya Chandran, who had assisted in Robert Ayer's procedure and had apparently been struggling with her own version of the same conflict. "I heard they're changing the report," she said, her voice low, like she was worried about being overheard even on the phone. I was in that room. I heard the alarm. I heard it stop. I didn't say anything in my statement because Colin asked me not to make it sound like anyone did anything wrong on purpose. I don't think he meant to hurt anyone. But I can't keep pretending I didn't hear what I heard. That conversation gave me something I hadn't had before, a second, independent witness whose account matched the raw audit data exactly, someone with no motive to lie and every reason to feel exactly as conflicted as I did. 2 days later, I submitted a formal complaint to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, attaching the original, unaltered audit trail, my own investigative notes, and, with her explicit permission, a summary of my conversation with Priya Chandran. I did not tell Renata or Dr. Okafor before I filed it. I understood, by then, exactly what would happen to that report if I gave them the chance to intercept it the way my anticoagulant recommendation had quietly disappeared months earlier. Within a week, I was placed on administrative leave, officially, pending review of documentation handling procedures, a phrase vague enough to mean almost anything and specific enough that everyone on the floor understood exactly what it implied. The state investigation moved faster than I expected, partly because the audit trail I'd provided was unambiguous in a way few whistleblower complaints are, and partly, I would later learn, because I wasn't the only person who had quietly reached out to state investigators about patterns at Alden Regional. A former nurse, terminated 18 months earlier under circumstances I hadn't known about, had filed a similar complaint about pressure to soften documentation on a different surgical complication, one investigators had initially closed without action for lack of corroborating evidence. My audit trail, combined with Priya's statement, gave that earlier case new weight, and within 6 weeks, state investigators had expanded their review into a broader examination of documentation practices across the surgical department. Not just Robert Ayer's case. Robert Ayer's widow, Mira, learned the truth about the silenced alert not from the hospital, but from a state investigator who contacted her directly as part of the formal inquiry. I wasn't in the room for that conversation, and I've never asked her to describe it to me, because some kinds of pain aren't mine to ask about. What I do know is that she retained an attorney within days and filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the hospital 3 months later, a lawsuit in which both the original and the revised versions of the incident report became central pieces of evidence. I was deposed as part of that lawsuit, sitting across from hospital attorneys who tried, gently and then less gently, to suggest that my complaint had been motivated by a personal grudge against Dr. Okafor or Renata Ashford rather than genuine concern. I answered every question the same way I'd answered Agent Amaro's questions in a different case entirely, months and worlds away from this one. Calmly, factually, and entirely supported by documentation I'd secured before anyone had the chance to make it disappear. The state's final report, issued 9 months after Robert Ayer's death, confirmed what the audit trail had always shown: a documented, years-long pattern of staff silencing anesthesia alerts due to unaddressed equipment reliability issues, a falsified incident report attempting to obscure that pattern in this specific case, and a chain of decision-making that traced administrative pressure directly to both Renata Ashford and Dr. Preston Okafor. The hospital was fined, placed under a corrective action plan with mandatory external oversight, and required to replace the anesthesia monitoring system across every operating room in the facility. Dr. Okafor resigned before the report's public release. Renata was terminated the same week, her 15 years of institutional standing unable to survive documentation that, unlike so many of the situations she'd successfully managed before, had never actually disappeared. Colin Massey, the administrator who had silenced the alert, was not charged criminally. The investigation concluded, consistent with what Renata had told me from the very beginning, that he had genuinely believed he was silencing a false alarm, the same way staff had done routinely for years, and that the true failure lay with the hospital leadership that had known about the underlying equipment problem and chosen not to fix it rather than disrupt operations. He left Alden Regional voluntarily a few months later, and the one time I saw him afterward, in a grocery store parking lot of all places, he simply nodded at me, tired and hollowed out in a way that made it clear he'd been living with his own version of that 4-minute gap every day since April. My own reinstatement, once the investigation concluded, came with an offer to return to my original position, an offer I turned down. I couldn't reconcile working inside an institution I now understood too clearly, even one under new leadership genuinely trying to rebuild trust. Instead, I took a position with a regional patient safety advocacy organization, work that let me use everything I'd learned about how hospitals fail patients to help other hospitals fix the same gaps before they cost someone their life. Mira Ayer and I met once, months after her lawsuit settled, at a coffee shop she chose near her home. She thanked me, though I told her honestly that I didn't feel like someone who deserved thanks, only someone who had done the bare minimum of what my job should have always meant. She told me something I've carried with me since, something that reframed the entire year for me in a way I hadn't managed on my own. "You didn't do the bare minimum," she said. "The bare minimum was staying quiet. What you did was the hard version of your job. Most people never find out there's a difference until it's too late to choose." Alden Regional now runs an annual patient safety review named, at the state's recommendation and the hospital's eventual agreement, after Robert Ayer, a permanent, public accounting of every serious complication the hospital experiences each year, published in full, without the 4-minute gaps that once made the truth so easy to erase. The last note in the file I kept during those months isn't something Renata said, or something from the state's final report. It's something I wrote myself, the night I decided to file that first complaint instead of signing the revised timeline, and I've never deleted it. They believed the truth was something a hospital could manage, soften, and eventually make disappear. They forgot that somewhere in every system, there's always one person willing to make a copy before they hand anything over.